Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Expats Portugal calling webinar where we're talking to Daniel Reis of Reis Pellicano about buying property here in Portugal. Great to have you here, Daniel. Tonight, we'll be talking about reservation agreements. I'm just going to whet people's appetites with a few things that we'll be talking about this evening. Reservation agreements, listings and advertisements, whether they can be trusted or not. Plots and buildability, buying somewhere and thinking you can build, not necessarily so. We'll go into that. Escrow, and whether that occurs here in Portugal. Property inspection, how to approach that. HOAs, condominiums, we've talked about that before, but it's always a good subject to return to let people know what they're up against should they buy an apartment. The CPCV, which is new technology or a new abbreviation for people buying a home here in Portugal. And what's it like on the day of the deed signing and renovations? What can possibly go wrong with those sorts of things? And maybe we could start with a little bit of context and referring to which bits you actually cover, Daniel, because I know this is quite an important distinction as well. Which part of the house buying process you do and you don't deal with. Good evening to you. Great to have you here.
Good evening. Great to be here as usual. Well, the bit that we usually do is the legal procedure of acquiring a house. So we're not realtors, we're not buyer's agents. The client needs to select the property that he wants to buy. If the client wishes, we usually are able to negotiate the price of the property and the terms and conditions, but the selection out of the property and the visits out of the property, this is on the client's side or the client with the buyer's agent or with the realtor. So we're not financial advisors, we're not property advisors. We can look into the property documentations and ascertain if all is according to what it should, but we're not the proper people to select properties. We are the law firm that can assist you to divert your attention from a really bad deal, but the house that it is your dream house, this is usually on the client's side to choose.
That's fantastic. And we've already got a testimonial on that note. Evening all. Thank you very much for this, Robert. Daniel saved Rehan and I from buying the wrong house this week. Wow. Many thanks, Daniel. So that's a great testimonial straight in. Stuart had first proper swim in the sea today. That's amazing. Brave man. I'm assuming that's in the Algarve. It probably is. And good evening, South Florida, Wales and Ohio. Just let us know where you are tuned in from tonight and we'll shout out to you. Let's get on with it with Daniel here this evening. A lot of what we're talking about, I think, Daniel, and Jackie's mentioned this in the past, is the difference. It's a perception difference, isn't it? Assuming that things might be the same where you're from in the UK or the US, and it is quite different here in Portugal. We can begin with reservation agreements, because that's one difference, isn't it?
Well, it is indeed. There's probably a trick that some real estate agencies like to pull, and this is to try to have a reservation agreement signed as fast as possible and some money guaranteed as a deposit. But in full reality, this doesn't have any legal binding, because a true reservation agreement should be done between the buyer and the seller. If the real estate agency is just putting a document in front of someone to reserve a property, well, they don't actually have the power to stop the seller from selling the house to someone else. Therefore, what is the reason of signing that reservation agreement? Well, the reason is that that real estate agency wants to try to bind the buyer or the potential buyer into that specific real estate agency. Because if you try to walk away, then they'll say, oh, you'll lose your reservation money. I've had some discussions with real estate agencies regarding these agreements, and I was able to overrun 2 or 3 different situations that the clients already signed reservation agreements and paid the reservations with just a simple factor stating the following. Reservation agreements are not legal. They're not allowed by the IMPIC, by the regulation agency here in Portugal. And they are a practice in the market, but the real estate agency cannot keep the money if the client decides to back down. Right. Therefore, it's a document that, although it's a common practice in the market, the advice that I have for any potential buyer is please don't sign any reservation agreements. If you want to reserve the property, It can be done, a reservation agreement between the buyer and the seller only. The real estate agency will not sign anything because they don't need to. Real estate agencies cannot reserve the property on behalf of the seller, even if they have an exclusive deal, because some real estate agencies do work with exclusivity. They are the only ones able to publicize the property. But even though the seller can decide to sell to someone else and just pay the commission to that realtor, and the buyer will have, let's say, 5K as a deposit, just in the ether, and that's not advisable. So reservation agreements is something that I really strongly discourage the clients from signing. If the deal is to be done, then a promissory purchase agreement, or a CPCV, as you just called it, is the right tool, because that is the document that binds the parties to the deal. And one other thing that I usually point out is that in Portugal, offers are not really binding, because you can do an offer, the offer can be accepted, but if the seller wants to sell to someone else, he is able to do so. And no actual penalty will come out of it unless the potential buyer can prove that he had some financial penalty because of the expectations that were created by the deal. So indeed, the thing that is really binding is the promissory purchase agreement. And until then, the property can be sold to someone else. That's the outline
Very
of the.
interesting. Yeah, so first preconception that might be challenged there this evening, and we'll have more of that sort of thing from Daniel for sure. Avoid those reservation agreements. But by that stage, Daniel, people will be once they've chosen the property and they're talking to you, that you can take care of them in making a different kind of agreement other than the reservation agreement, as you said there. Great. Okay. Another difference that we should talk about is how properties are listed and advertised, and trade description. Some people coming from other parts of the world will be thinking, well, what I read about is what I'm buying. That's not necessarily the case here, is it?
Well, I can just convey, without violating professional secrecy, a case that happened today. A detached house in the Cascais area was being advertised with 100 square meters more than what is registered within the documents. And the client actually did an offer. The offer was accepted, but the client was considering that the offer that he was doing was with X amount of square meters. And when we looked into the documents and looked into the listing, we saw, well, things don't add up. We confronted the real estate agency and they said, well, forget about the listing. What's correct is the property documents. And the client said, well, my calculations on the price per square meter were done on what was on the listing because we didn't have any documents. So stuff like that can happen. And other things that I've seen in the past, for instance, an external garden in a building inside Lisbon, so in the downtown of the city, there's a lot of out places or small gardens that are listed as private property. But in some instances, they are common property. And this does, of course, affect the value of that common space. So be wary of what is in the listing. The usual trick that we use is we consult the listing, we take prints of everything, because if things do get serious, we have evidences of what was publicized. But the reality of it is that for players, that real estate agencies that are not serious in the market or like to try to well, create square meters out of thin air, there's no actually big penalty on this, because again, the agency IMPIC that regulates the real estate agencies here in Portugal, there's a lack of oversight. So the licenses are not usually revoked, they're not usually taken away. So real estate agencies, if they're not serious, they can do whatever they want, and there's no actual big consequence on this. I do remember one of the case of a house that was the top apartment on a building. And on the roof, the construction company did basically an extra apartment on the roof. But that extra apartment was a common area out of the building. And if all the other condominium unit holders would wish to basically forbidden the person to use that bought the apartment to use the upper part. They could because it's a common area. And the house was being sold as the main apartment and the top apartment, all everything together. And this is again is false advertisement. So I've seen it all in the market. Take the listings with a grain of salt. Only after the documents are consulted, only after we see the blueprints, is indeed that we can be sure of what is being sold. If there's 5 more square meters or 5 less square meters, I would consider that normal. That's okay, and it's something that we can live with. But 100 square meters, that's a bit off the charts.
Yeah. And am I right in thinking if you do end up buying something like that, it becomes your responsibility to put it right?
Correct. And this is the part where usually real estate agencies, they wash their hands and they say, well, I'm just a mediator. I put the buyer and the seller in contact,
Yes.
and that's it. So don't expect the same level of responsibility that you would probably see in the UK or the US, because real estate agencies they are responsible for what they list and advertise. The real estate agencies here, they'll wash their hands and say, oh, that's not my problem. I just put A in contact with B. So if B wanted to buy the property and it's not something you should have done is due diligence.
Yeah.
That's what it's going to be conveyed. And therefore, it's something that the buyer will end up being responsible to legalize. So let's say that you bought a detached house and that it has, or a pool that it wasn't legalized, or a garage that it wasn't legalized. The buyer is actually the one responsible for the legalization procedure within the municipality, if it is possible, because in some instances it may not be possible. There's a ratio of square meters that you can build in a plot that if that ratio is already surpassed, then the buildings that were built illegally, they will need to be demolished. There's no way to legalize them. This can be the extreme option.
Yeah.
The other options is you need to hire an architect, you need to hire an engineer, and they will need to basically do reverse engineering and do the blueprints of what is already built. Then you submit it to the municipality, have a year or two in proceedings with the municipality to legalize the situation, and eventually the current owner is the one responsible to pay the fines if they are applicable from the municipality, from those outbuildings, let's call it that, not being legalized in the correct terms. So it's really important that the documents are indeed double checked so the buyer knows what he is buying and doesn't end up with a lot of problems and a big headache and money spent that he was not accounting for.
I mean, that does sound painful and stressful. So absolutely right. Get it right first time rather than going into that and having all of that to deal with in retrospect. And that's
We
why you're sorry, go ahead,
that
Dan.
we try to remove the stress as much as
Yeah,
possible. In
right.
some instances, what we tell the clients is, well, we tell it as it is. We tell the exact consequences, and the client is, of course, the one that will decide if they want to proceed with the property purchase or not. But we try to remove the headaches as much as we can and convey the information as better as we can, because as we're not an interested party in the deal, we are just interested that the client buys something with the legal assurances that he needs. Well, we don't receive a commission out of the deal, and realtors do receive a commission out of the deal. So they have an invested interest in trying to push the deal and to basically camouflage the parts that are not the good ones in the property. And I'm not talking about mold, I'm talking about stuff that is in the documents that they may not communicate to the potential buyers.
Yeah, and that's why your advocacy and oversight is so useful because yeah, the seller wants to get rid of it and wants to sell it to you, and the real estate agent wants their commission as well, and you have a whole load more professional objectivity in that process. Great. Thank you everybody for your questions that are starting to come in. That's great. Good evening to our Canadians as well. Thank you very much for being here this evening. Great questions. We'll get to those after we've gone through a few things with Daniel tonight. Plots. The tax authority has an idea of the plot, and the camera has an idea of the plot. Who's right?
It's the camera. So it's the
Right.
municipality that determines if a plot is able to have anything built on it. There's a document in Portugal called Caderneta Predial or tax registry. And this document can be classified as urban or rural. And some people do think this is a common myth in Portugal for Portuguese people and for foreigners alike, that if it says urban, you can build on it. That's incorrect, because this is just a tax classification and it's not indicative that you can indeed build something on the plot. What determines that is what we call the PDM, or the Municipal Director Plan. And this is where the municipality decided to allocate land or to agricultural, or to factories, or to commercial buildings, or to plots that you can build a house. So having this due diligence done in the municipality instead of the tax authorities is the way to go. And even if it's listed again, a property that it's an urban tax registration, this doesn't mean anything if you want to build a house in Portugal.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Let's take Peter's question at that point because it's connected. I see a lot of properties advertised as being a rural house. Does this mean a house with no habitable license, or as in the UK, a house located in a rural area, i.e. the countryside?
I would say that it's a house located in the rural area, because if it's a house, and if everything is done properly, that house had a license to be built. There's a difference that I think that I should point out, because the first urban laws that we had nationwide they were set in 1951. So there's a big difference on properties that were built before 1951 and after 1951. At that time, what the government decided was everything that is built until now, until 1951, is considered automatically legalized. So no extra procedures with the municipality and whatnot. After 1951, anyone that wanted to build a house would need a permit from the municipality and to submit the plans and all of that. So if a house was built before 1951, it will not have a utilization license issued from the municipality. It's just a declaration from the municipality acknowledging that that house is built before 1951, and that's basically it. If it's after 1951, it will have this utilization license, and this will come out of the municipality stating that that property was built up to code. If the house is in a rural setting, usually people will state, well, the house is rural, but if all was done properly, it will need to have or the authorization license, or this it was built before 1951.
Amazing. Really, I mean, a key takeaway tonight is to check your assumptions. I mean,
Yeah.
we can't help it as human beings, can we? But to make assumptions, but double check them, as we're finding out again and again here with what Daniel's telling us. And I'm sure this will be included as well. The assumption that there might be escrow here in Portugal. It doesn't work like that here, does it?
No, not at all. In our law firm, we can act a bit as an escrow account, but it's not in the same way or sense that you'll see in the US or the UK, because the payments, once you are doing a property acquisition in the country, are usually done between or directly from the buyer to the seller. Once you sign the promissory purchase agreement, the first contract that binds the parties, usually down payment, let's say 10%, 50%. Nothing is written in the law, actually, so the parties can agree the number that they find it's most convenient. But that payment, pardon, is usually done via a wire transfer from one account to the other. And we usually do recommend that the account that the money departs is a Portuguese account. If the clients do not have yet a Portuguese account, they usually transfer the money to our client's account. It's a separate account that we have just to have money from our clients circulating for property acquisitions, paying taxes, and other expenses that the clients may have. And then once the contracts are signed, we will transfer the money into the sellers. And the other bit is the payment, the final payment out of the house is done via a banking check in Portugal, the old-fashioned way, because wire transfers in Portugal can eventually be contested, can be, you can go to the bank and say it's a fraud, and they will suspend the full transfer procedure, and it may become messy. So the way to fully guarantee that the money is really there for a property acquisition is via a banking check. Again, the concept of escrow would assist greatly in a property deal because the escrow would control the payments. But as we don't have it here in Portugal, do bear in mind that the payments will be done directly from the buyer to the seller. The first one is usually done via wire transfer. The second one, the final payment, is usually done via a banking check.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much for that. Do you think it's likely to change anytime soon, Daniel?
I don't think so, unless they do create the figure of the escrow agent in the law. I do think that it would greatly increase the security of a property purchase, because the escrow will be the pivotal in all of it and would control the payments and would see the legality out of the real estate operation. And this could, for instance, be the notary, but it's not foreseen in the law. So there's no way to know if this is going to be a reality in the future. For the time being, no political discussion was said on this one.
And a very old-fashioned paper check, then we will continue with here in Portugal. It's quite nice, isn't it, in a way, to have the champagne and the check.
It is. It is. The
Right.
deep, but probably I'll jump a bit on the points that you outlined over there. But on the day of the deeds, the thing that I usually outline to the clients is that everyone will be sitting down at the same table at the same time, and the deed will be read out loud in Portuguese. If the client is not there and we are representing the client, we'll sign the deed, and that's basically it. If the client is there, what we do is we act as sworn-in translators, and we translate the deed orally to the client and make sure that he really understands what we are signing on his behalf.
Wow.
Once everyone is happy with the text out of the deed, and usually the text out of the deed is quite short comparing to the text out of the promissory purchase agreement, because the text out of the promissory purchase agreement is where all the clauses that guarantee that it's a safe purchase are inserted, and liability clauses that allow us to sue if something is not disclosed in the proper fashion. So the deed is something as simple as the identification of the buyer, identification of the seller, identification of the property price, and that's basically it. And the number of the banking check. It's really simple, 1 to 2 page documents. And once the deed is signed, the seller will provide the banking check to the buyer. The buyer will provide the keys out of the house, and the notary will do the registration out of the deed in the electronic system to change the name of the seller to the buyer. On our side, what we usually do is register the house in the name of the clients on the tax authorities, because this is a cumbersome procedure that usually is not done via the notary system. So we do it separately to guarantee that it's all okay. And usually deeds do end up on a friendly note. So everyone will be shaking hands or hugging.
Yeah, that's what I
And
was going to ask you. So the buyer hands their paper check over, and there
yeah,
might be some handshaking and popping of
correct.
champagne corks and all those
And
cousins you've got together as
and
well.
it's a fun moment. I like
Mm.
to go and represent clients on the day of the purchase, because it is a light moment. It is a fun moment. Usually, the moments that lead to the deed are a bit stressful to
Yes.
coordinate the payments, issue of banking checks within the banks, and banks in Portugal sometimes they're not as expedited as we would wish. So the moments that lead into the deed are a bit stressful, but on the day or at the time that the deed is being signed, it's really a fun moment, and I like to be there and to represent the clients.
I imagine
Um,
you've taken one or two photographs of those
oh
moments
yeah,
as well.
definitely. This is a cultural thing that usually realtors like to do, and it's fun. They like to put everyone in the same picture with the deed, and everyone will have a fun picture, and they will post it on the social networks and state, well, one more house sold. So
Yeah, of
it's
course.
fun. Yeah,
Very good. Very good. Zé Maria, we'll come back to you. And I notice you'll be first in the queue to ask a question when we go to that part of the presentation tonight. And thank you for all the questions that are coming through on the chat. And don't forget, when we conclude the recording, there's another chance to ask questions that you might not want recorded in the public domain. So, Zé Maria, I see you there. I'll come to you as soon as we've finished running through the points here with Daniel. We'll go back a bit in the process to inspections. Now, they're not automatic, are they, or a requirement here in Portugal to have an
No.
inspection? Do you recommend, and when do you
Oh,
recommend?
Uh, definitely, I do recommend the property inspection, and it's before any contracts are signed and any money swaps hands. So basically, once the offer is accepted, once the sellers do accept the offer, this is the correct time to retain an architect or an engineer, someone that can go and look into the property with a professional perspective on it. So on our side, we are, let's call it, paper pushers. We look into documents, but we're not civil engineers. I don't know if the house was properly built or not. So this is a job of usually an engineer or an architect. And it's better to have the property inspected before any money swaps hands, because opposing to what happens in the US, usually the offer is accepted, then the person does or the buyer retains a property inspection, and then people will negotiate the price with the stuff that was found out by the property inspector. This culturally in Portugal does not work out. It simply doesn't. We've tried it before in some different variations. It does not. So the best way to do this is offer is accepted, property is inspected. If something horrible is found out with the property, this can be discussed on with the buyer and try to haggle down the price. But if it's just normal stuff, then there's no wiggle room or leverage to discuss the price again. So do be mindful that having a property inspected is more to find any horrible stuff that was not disclosed than to have some mechanism to get back into the negotiation room and try to haggle the price down. That will face a lot of resistance from the sellers, and it's not something that people in Portugal are accustomed to. And in reality, there's not a lot of Portuguese citizens that will retain an inspection of a property. This is something that we've seen in the market, brought especially by US nationals, and I think it's a really good practice, and people are getting used to it now, but 5 years ago, this was unheard of, I would say.
Very good cultural insight there. Thank you very much indeed. Right. Side note, of course, you can find Daniel in the Expats Portugal business directory alongside the people who can finance your purchase, manage the currency exchange, and of course, the inspection we've just been talking about. So find all those professionals in the Expats Portugal business directory. And of course, as a premium member, you'll get discounts off some of their services as well. Okay, wonderful. Condominiums, house owners associations, that sort of thing. We've laughed and joked about this because you spent quite a lot of time, I think, at some of these meetings, Daniel. But you can be very helpful, can't you, in finding out what people are letting themselves in for when they buy an apartment and what
Yeah.
their responsibilities might be within that association.
Well, on a personal note, I bought a detached house to avoid condominium meetings because I went to a few representing my parents.
Yeah.
And well, I said to myself, I don't want to buy an apartment. I want a detached house and avoid the condominium meetings altogether. And here we are as a lawyer representing a lot of clients in the condominium meetings. Sometimes this is the glory moment. The condominium meetings is the glory moment that people are waiting for the full year. So they like to talk and talk a lot, and they're not too practical about the topics of the conversation. But this is just a side note. On a preventive level, once someone is buying a property, we do usually request the minutes of the decisions of the last 3 years, because nowadays, to have a property transaction, you need to have a declaration from the condominium stating that the seller does not owe any money to the housing association.
Ah.
But there's a caveat. Although this declaration is quite useful, stating that there's no money being owed, let's say that the housing association did sit down 2 months ago and decided to have a full renovation on the property, and that will cost 50K. and divided by each of the condominium unit holders is 5K. But those 5K, instead of being paid at the time that the decision was taken, will be paid within 6 months. Then the new buyer is the one responsible for assuming that expense. So what we try to do to avoid any liability in this regard is to request the minutes within the last 3 years, read the minutes, perceive the history of the building, the history of the repairs, and if there's any foreseen renovations that the apartments will need. Because usually, as things are, I would say, a tad slow, unless it's something urgent, people will start discussing a renovation in the condominium meetings 2 or 3 years before it happens. So before we jump into a promissory purchase agreement, we request the track record of at least the three last years, have an idea of what that housing association is doing, if they are properly managed, if they just don't care at all. And we put this in the property report that we usually deliver to the client, because this is something that is sometimes overlooked, as it's not a mandatory document to deliver on a deed, the last 3 years of decisions. People sometimes do overlook this, and this is something that we try to perceive what is the reality of the housing association, because it can be a world of hurt or eventually financial burden if it's not properly looked at. And this is leverage. Let's say that we find something that was not disclosed, and that is a potential expense for the new buyer. Well, this is leverage to get back into the negotiation table and state, well, there's a 5K expense down the line. You didn't disclose this, so we want a reduction in price of 5K, for instance. So this is something that we try to do on a preventive level for sure.
Well, that's some very interesting forensic work you're doing there, isn't it? To disclose or uncover such things. You know, you might see that the roof hasn't been repaired for a very long time, and it's going to be this new buyer who's going to be hit with that. So very interesting. That's working with the associations that run apartment blocks there that Daniel can help you with. You've explained very, very beautifully what happens on the day of the deed. Before that, the CPCV there. This sounds like something that might come up on LinkedIn. Your CV. You don't need that for a house purchase. What is the CPCV?
So this is an acronym, and it basically means a preliminary contract that binds the parties into buying that specific property on a specific timeline with a set price. So once a potential buyer is doing an offer, he should put some details in the offer. The first and foremost is the price. Is usually what buyers are or sellers, I'm sorry, are more interested at, is what is the price of the offer. The other key aspect is the closing window. So in Portugal, if you are doing a normal property purchase cash, I usually advise a closing window between 1 month to 2 months. But this depends widely on the seller, because if the seller still has furniture in the property, if they still need to find a new house, there's a lot of stuff that can stop a property from being transaction quickly. And this is, I would say, a custom in Portugal. People will put the houses on the market just to feel the market, and they're not ready to sell. So in some instances, 3 months closing window, 4 months closing window is something that it can be expected, and because of the sellers not being able to sell quickly. One really relevant note is that if the house is being bought with a bank loan, so it will entail a mortgage, my usual advice is that at least minimum the closing window should be 3 months, because banks do drag their feet. They take some time to evaluate the properties, and the usual procedure with the bank is they will do a preliminary check on the financial condition out of the client. If they give the green lights, then the client chooses a property. That property will need to be assessed and evaluated. Once that evaluation is done and it's at least au pair with the price that the potential buyer is paying, then the bank will do another financial assessment out of the buyer and will request more documents. So all this back and forth, especially with considering foreign documents, does take some time. So if you're buying a house with a loan, for sure, put a closing window within 3 months. And one thing that I usually emphasize is that it's a closing window. It's not 3 months, and on 90 days you close. You can either close on the 40th day or something in between. So although it states 90 days to close, it can be less than that. But to have some safeguard and some wiggle room, indeed 90 days, it's the desired closing time. What else needs to be covered here? So the CPCV is the contract that basically locks in the conditions that were set in the offer. So the CPCV will, of course, will have the price, will have any terms and conditions that were negotiated in terms of does the property needs to be painted, does the property need to be cleaned. So any specific thing that needs to be done prior to the sale, should be inserted in this contract. And the closing window, as I said, if it entails a loan or not. So all the preliminary conditions to have the sale done are inserted in the CPCV. And the consequences, I think they are breaking the contract, I think that they are really relevant to outline. If the seller decides not to sell, and he has a down payment of, let's say, 50K already on his pocket, what happens? Well, you will need to reimburse the potential buyer out of those 50K, and as a penalty, pay a penalty of 50K. So basically, if the seller does not sell, you will lose the down payment and will need to pay a penalty equal to the down payment that he received initially to the buyer. But the same type of consequence does occur to the buyer as well. So let's say that the buyer decides to walk away from a property deal. You will lose the down payment. So it is the serious deal. It is something that can be really a big financial burden. Therefore, the parties will need to do all the due diligence before the contract is signed and before the money swaps hands. And this is something that I usually outline to the clients, is that you really need to be sure that this is the house that you want to buy, because once you sign this contract and the money is transferred, it's really difficult to break this contract. One other thing that I think is really, really important to outline in terms of the promissory purchase agreements is there's a practice in the market that real estate agencies try to push, is to have the promissory purchase agreements without the signature notarization. By law, it's mandatory to have the signature notarization in a promissory purchase agreement. If the contract does not have the signature notarization, one of the parties can claim and go to court and try to have the contract null or nullified. And to avoid all that, we do not do any contracts in our law firm that do not have the signatures notarized. The real estate agencies will see that this as just being bureaucratic, as lawyers being lawyers. It's not us wanting to create difficulties in a deal. It's really the law, and the consequences of a lengthy legal battle in court to get a contract declared null, it's just mayhem. So to avoid all that, we do signature notarization in all the contracts that we assist clients here. And this is something that I strongly advise to everyone that is buying a property. Do not waive signature notarization, because it can be a world of hurt if you do, and if the seller decides to try to nullify the contract because he found someone else that is a higher bidder. So it's a really, really strong advice.
That's great. Thank you, Daniel. So a very important document, the CPCV. I think just one more thing on renovations, because I think you negotiate with construction companies as well, don't you? And there are some difficulties that people have got into that you might want to elaborate on and share with people.
So the first advice that I usually have to all the clients is that if you are retaining any renovations that are above 2K, have a renovation contract. Because it's really common in Portugal, things will get delayed, builders will drag their feet, and then they will state, no, this was not what we talked about, and it's all word of mouth. So if it's something, I would say, substantial above 2K, a renovation agreement is highly advisable. The usual way that we structure this is the builder will do, basically, they will produce a budget with all the items of the things that they will do, budgeting everything individually, pardon. And then we will develop a contract that will refer to that budget and that will have deadlines of delivery of the renovations and penalties, and this is quite important, the penalty part, for each day of non-delivery or non-compliance from the builder. Because what we see in the market is the following. Builders usually accept more work than they are able to deliver. And what they do is they juggle between dissatisfied clients. So the one that is screaming the loudest is usually the one that they will attend to, and they will work for 1 or 2 weeks over there. Then they will go into the other person that is starting to scream louder, and so on and so forth. But one thing is for sure, that if they have 5 different renovations running at the same time, but there's one with penalties in the contract for late delivery, for sure they will prioritize the renovation that will have financial penalties. We usually insert financial penalties around 100 euros per day to 150 euros per day, depending on what is the type of renovation. And my usual negotiation technique is the following. The builder states, well, I'll take 2 months to deliver this renovation. What I usually advise the clients is, well, concede to the builder 3 months, but after the 3 months, there's this penalty of late delivery that should be enforced. And at least it avoids things going south. We've had, even with contracts, we've had things going south, but it avoids the problems as much as possible. And one of the advice that I have in terms of renovation is for the owners of a property, try to have all the things that you want to be developed done on one go. And when I state this is the following. What I perceive that happens with a lot of people, it happened with me. When a construction is being, or a renovation is being done, ideas will pop out. And they will say, oh, why don't you do this? And why don't you do that? And this extra work and that extra work. And this is usually a general excuse that builders will try to slide in and state, well, the person or the property owner asked for extra work, and that's why we are late on the delivery of the initial work. So if possible, try to have everything that you wish done in the property from the get-go, because otherwise this is a legitimate, I would say, argument that the builder will have to for the penalty not to be enforced and for their late delivery of a renovation.
Very interesting insight there. Very helpful too, as all this information you've been sharing with us this evening. I think we should probably bring the recording to a close, and we'll go to all of these questions after the end of the recording, because you've given us some amazing information across about 40 minutes there, Daniel. But just to give you a last word, thank you so much. Superb information, brilliantly put. Clearly a great resource in this matter, and available via the Expats Portugal business directory. That's where you'll find Daniel Reis of Reis Pellicano, or Daniel dos Reis, to give him his full title there. Anything you'd like to say in closing, Daniel? It's been brilliant tonight. Thanks as ever to you.
Well, the last note is probably I was a bit too harsh on realtors. You have a lot of good professionals in Portugal, really a lot of good professionals in Portugal. But unfortunately, there's not the correct tools or mechanisms to weed out the bad professionals. But I've worked with really amazing realtors in Portugal. There's a lot of people that are professional and they will defend your best interests, but some of them, they just want their commission. So I just want to outline that, because probably I was a bit too harsh in the beginning, but it's...
Well, that's very fair of you. That's very fair of you. Some people might call you just to get the names of those people. And of course, we have a few of those in the Expats Portugal business directory as well. A few great real estate professionals in there covering the country too. So let's leave it there. Thanks so much, Daniel. It's been brilliant tonight. And we'll come to the questions that we've got in the chat here. Thank you so much for now.